Sarah Martinez had always prided herself on her discipline and professionalism. At 24, she was one of the youngest communications specialists at Fort Henderson, a sprawling military base in Texas. Her days were filled with coordinating radio transmissions, managing satellite communications, and ensuring that critical information flowed seamlessly between different units. She loved her job and respected the chain of command that governed military life. The morning of March 15th started like any other. Sarah arrived at the communications center at 0600 hours, her uniform crisp and her long brown hair pulled back into a regulation bun. She had spent 3 years perfecting her military bearing, and her superiors had always praised her attention to detail and unwavering professionalism. Colonel Marcus Blackwood was a different story altogether. At 52, he was a career military man with a reputation for being tough but fair. However, recent months had shown a darker side of his personality. Younger female soldiers had whispered about his inappropriate comments and lingering stares, but nobody dared to speak up officially. The military culture of the early 2000s made such complaints risky for the accusers rather than the accused. That morning, Colonel Blackwood entered the communications center with his usual authoritative stride. Sarah was bent over a radio console, carefully adjusting frequency settings for an upcoming training exercise. She was completely absorbed in her work, unaware that the colonel had approached from behind. "Specialist Martinez." The colonel's voice boomed across the room, causing several other personnel to look up from their stations. Sarah immediately straightened and turned around, snapping to attention. "Yes, sir." The colonel stepped closer, his eyes scanning her appearance with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Your hair is out of regulation," he said, though Sarah knew this wasn't true. Her bun was perfectly positioned and secured. Before Sarah could respond or even process what was happening, Colonel Blackwood reached out and grabbed a handful of her hair. With a sharp, violent motion, he yanked her head backward, causing her to stumble and nearly fall. "This is what happens when soldiers don't maintain proper standards," he said loudly, ensuring everyone in the room could hear. Sarah's eyes watered from the sudden pain, and she could feel several strands of hair being pulled from her scalp. The room fell into complete silence. The half-dozen other soldiers present stopped what they were doing and stared in shock. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The sound of humming electronics and distant bass activity seemed amplified in the sudden quiet. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what had just happened. The colonel still had his hand tangled in her hair, and she could smell his coffee breath as he leaned close to her face. "Do I make myself clear, Specialist?" he asked in a low, threatening voice. "Yes, sir," Sarah managed to whisper, her voice shaking with a mixture of pain, humiliation, and rage. The colonel released his grip and stepped back, smoothing down his own uniform as if nothing had happened. "Good, now get back to work, all of you," he commanded, scanning the room with a challenging stare. As the colonel walked out of the communications center, Sarah remained standing at attention for several more seconds. Her scalp throbbed and she could feel her face burning with embarrassment. The other soldiers in the room slowly returned to their duties, but she could feel their eyes on her. Sergeant Williams, a veteran communications specialist who had been working at the station next to Sarah, approached her quietly. "You okay, Martinez?" he asked in a low voice. Sarah nodded stiffly, not trusting herself to speak. She sat back down at her console and tried to focus on the radio frequencies, but her hands were shaking. The numbers and dials seemed to blur together as her mind replayed the incident over and over again. For the rest of the morning, Sarah worked in mechanical silence. She completed her assigned tasks with her usual precision, but inside a storm was building. She had never experienced anything like this in her military career. Physical contact of any kind, especially aggressive contact, was strictly prohibited between superior officers and subordinates. During her lunch break, Sarah sat alone in the mess hall, picking at her food without appetite. She thought about calling her mother back home in California, but what would she say? How could she explain that a respected colonel had physically assaulted her in front of witnesses, and nobody had done anything to stop it? As she sat there, she overheard two female soldiers at a nearby table discussing their own experiences with Colonel Blackwood. Their voices were hushed, but Sarah caught fragments of their conversation. Words like inappropriate, uncomfortable, and can't report it drifted over to her table. Sarah realized she wasn't alone. Colonel Blackwood's behavior wasn't an isolated incident, and she wasn't his only target. This revelation filled her with a new kind of anger. How many other women had he treated this way? How many had suffered in silence? That afternoon, Sarah returned to the communications center with a new sense of purpose. She threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, but her mind was already forming a plan. She couldn't let this incident slide. She couldn't allow Colonel Blackwood to continue abusing his authority and humiliating female soldiers. As the day wore on, Sarah began to notice things she had previously overlooked. The way other female soldiers tensed up when the colonel entered a room, the way conversation stopped when he appeared, the subtle signs of fear and discomfort that had become so normalized that they had become invisible. That evening, as Sarah prepared to leave the base for the day, she made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to report the incident through normal military channels, where complaints often disappeared into bureaucratic black holes or resulted in retaliation against the complainants. Instead, she was going to do something that would ensure Colonel Blackwood's behavior could never be ignored or covered up again. She was going to make sure that his actions would have consequences that he never saw coming. Consequences that would reverberate throughout the entire base and beyond. As she walked to her car in the parking lot, Sarah felt a mixture of fear and determination coursing through her veins. She knew that what she was planning would be risky, possibly career-ending. But she also knew that she couldn't live with herself if she remained silent and allowed other women to suffer the same humiliation and abuse she had experienced. The next phase of her plan would require careful preparation, absolute discretion, and perfect timing. Colonel Blackwood had made a serious mistake when he decided to target Sarah Martinez. He had no idea that he had just awakened a force that would ultimately bring about his downfall in the most spectacular way possible. Sarah spent the next 3 days carefully observing and documenting Colonel Blackwood's behavior patterns. She arrived at work earlier and stayed later, taking mental notes of his schedule, his interactions with female personnel, and his general conduct around the base. What she discovered was even worse than she had initially suspected. During her discreet investigation, Sarah witnessed the colonel making inappropriate comments to a young female mechanic in the motor pool. She observed him standing uncomfortably close to female soldiers during routine briefings, and she noticed how his eyes lingered on women in ways that made them visibly uncomfortable. Most importantly, Sarah began reaching out to other female soldiers on the base. She approached these conversations carefully, never directly mentioning her own incident at first. Instead, she asked general questions about base morale, working conditions, and relationships with superior officers. The responses she received were eye-opening. Private Jessica Chen, a supply specialist, confided that Colonel Blackwood had cornered her in a storage room the previous month and made suggestive comments about her uniform fitting just right. Corporal Amanda Walsh shared that the colonel had repeatedly asked her to work late shifts alone with him, requests that made her so uncomfortable she had started trading shifts with male colleagues. The most disturbing story came from Staff Sergeant Monica Torres, a veteran with 8 years of military service. Monica revealed that Colonel Blackwood had been systematically targeting female soldiers for over 2 years. She had tried to report his behavior once before, but her complaint had been buried by his supporters in the chain of command. Monica had been reassigned to less desirable duties after her complaint, effectively ending any chance of career advancement. As Sarah gathered these testimonies, she realized that Colonel Blackwood had created a culture of fear and silence. He had strategically chosen victims who felt powerless to speak up, and he had cultivated relationships with other officers who either turned a blind eye to his behavior or actively protected him. On the 4th day after the hair-pulling incident, Sarah made contact with someone who would prove crucial to her plan. Captain Jennifer Hayes was a military police officer who had recently transferred to Fort Henderson from a base in Colorado. Unlike many of the long-term personnel at Fort Henderson, Captain Hayes had no existing loyalties or obligations that might compromise her willingness to act on reports of misconduct. Sarah approached Captain Hayes during lunch at the mess hall, sitting down across from her at a mostly empty table. "Captain Hayes, I'd like to speak with you about a serious matter," Sarah said quietly. Captain Hayes looked up from her meal, immediately sensing the gravity in Sarah's voice. "Go ahead, Specialist." Sarah carefully recounted her own experience with Colonel Blackwood, providing exact details about the time, location, and witnesses present. She then shared the information she had gathered from other female soldiers, being careful not to use names without explicit permission. Captain Hayes listened intently, taking occasional notes in a small notebook she kept in her uniform pocket. Her expression grew increasingly serious as Sarah continued her account. "This is a pattern of behavior that constitutes sexual harassment and assault," Captain Hayes said when Sarah finished speaking. "But you understand that investigating a colonel requires substantial evidence and careful handling." Sarah nodded. "I understand, Captain. But I also understand that if nothing is done, this behavior will continue and probably get worse." Over the next week, Captain Hayes conducted her own discreet investigation. She interviewed the witnesses from the communications center incident, documenting their accounts of what they had seen and heard. She also spoke with several of the female soldiers Sarah had identified, gathering formal statements from those willing to go on record. What emerged was a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse of authority. Colonel Blackwood had been using his position to intimidate, humiliate, and sexually harass female soldiers for an extended period. He had created an environment where reporting such behavior seemed impossible due to his connections and influence within the base. Hierarchy, Captain Hayes also discovered something that would prove crucial to the case. Colonel Blackwood had been scheduled to receive a promotion and transfer to the Pentagon within 6 weeks. If action wasn't taken immediately, he would likely escape consequences for his actions and potentially gain access to an even larger pool of potential victims in his new position. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her normal duties while secretly collaborating with Captain Hayes. She maintained her professional demeanor around Colonel Blackwood, giving no indication that anything had changed. This required tremendous self-control, especially when she witnessed him continuing his inappropriate behavior toward other women. During this period, Sarah also began reaching out to external resources. She contacted a military advocacy group that specialized in supporting victims of sexual harassment and assault. Through this organization, she learned about recent changes in military policy that had strengthened protections for whistleblowers and created new avenues for reporting misconduct. The DSU advocacy group put Sarah in touch with a military lawyer who specialized in cases involving abuse of authority. This lawyer, Major Patricia Sullivan, had successfully prosecuted several high-profile cases of military sexual misconduct and had developed strategies for protecting whistleblowers from retaliation. Major Sullivan reviewed the evidence that Sarah and Captain Hayes had gathered and confirmed that they had a strong case. However, she warned them that prosecuting a colonel would require navigating complex military politics and that they should expect significant pushback from Colonel Blackwood's supporters. The key to success in cases like this, Major Sullivan explained during a confidential phone call, is to make the evidence so compelling and the misconduct so public that covering it up becomes impossible. This advice would prove prophetic. Sarah realized that simply filing a complaint through normal channels might result in the same buried investigation that had happened to Staff Sergeant Torres. She needed to ensure that Colonel Blackwood's behavior became impossible to ignore or cover up. As the second week of her investigation concluded, Sarah finalized a plan that would accomplish exactly that goal. Her strategy would involve perfect timing, careful coordination with multiple allies, and a willingness to take enormous personal risks. The plan would unfold during the base's annual inspection, scheduled for the following week. During this inspection, high-ranking officials from military headquarters would be present to evaluate base operations and personnel performance. It would be the perfect opportunity to ensure that Colonel Blackwood's misconduct received the attention it deserved from people with the authority to take immediate action. Sarah's next move would require courage, precision, and flawless execution. She knew that she would have only one chance to make her case, and the consequences of failure would be severe. But she also knew that the consequences of inaction would be even worse, both for herself and for every other woman who might become Colonel Blackwood's next victim. Stage was set for a confrontation that would shake Fort Henderson to its core and change military culture in ways that nobody could have anticipated. The weekend before the annual inspection, Sarah held a secret meeting that would prove to be the turning point in her campaign against Colonel Blackwood. She had rented a small conference room at a hotel just outside the base, paying for it with her own money to ensure complete privacy and avoid any possibility of military surveillance. The attendees included Captain Hayes, The 6 female soldiers who had agreed to provide formal testimony about Colonel Blackwood's behavior, and Major Sullivan, who had driven down from her office in San Antonio specifically for this meeting. Also present was an unexpected but crucial ally, Sergeant Major Robert Chen, Private Jessica Chen's father and a highly respected veteran with 28 years of military service. Sergeant Major Chen had initially been skeptical when his daughter approached him about Colonel Blackwood's behavior. However, after conducting his own discreet inquiries among the non-commissioned officer ranks, he had discovered a disturbing pattern of complaints and concerns that had been systematically ignored or suppressed by the base leadership. "I've served this military for nearly 3 decades," Sergeant Major Chen told the group, his voice heavy with disgust and determination. "I've seen a lot of things, but I've never seen anything as systematic and protected as what's happening with Colonel Blackwood." The meeting began with each woman sharing her story in detail. Sarah went first, recounting not only the hair-pulling incident but also the pattern of intimidating behavior she had observed since then. Her account was followed by testimonies from Private Chen, Corporal Walsh, Staff Sergeant Torres, and 3 other women who had been reluctant to come forward until they learned they weren't alone. The stories painted a picture of a predator who had carefully calculated his approach to maximize his power while minimizing the risk of meaningful consequences. Colonel Blackwood had targeted women who were relatively new to the base, who had limited support networks, or who were in vulnerable positions within the military hierarchy. Major Sullivan took detailed notes throughout the testimonies and explained the legal framework that would govern any formal proceedings against Colonel Blackwood. She outlined the challenges they would face, including the colonel's connections within the base leadership and the military's historical reluctance to aggressively prosecute high-ranking officers for sexual misconduct. However, Major Sullivan continued, "Recent policy changes and increased scrutiny from Congress have created new opportunities for justice. The key is ensuring that this case receives appropriate attention from the right people at the right time." Captain Hayes then outlined the intelligence she had gathered about the upcoming inspection. The visiting team would include General Patricia Morrison, a 3-star general known for her zero-tolerance approach to sexual harassment and misconduct. General Morrison had made her reputation by cleaning up problem bases and holding senior officers accountable for creating toxic environments. "If we can get this evidence in front of General Morrison," Captain Hayes explained, "she has the authority and the political backing to take immediate action, regardless of Colonel Blackwood's local connections." The challenge was figuring out how to ensure that General Morrison would encounter the evidence in a way that couldn't be intercepted or buried by Colonel Blackwood's allies. This is where Sarah's plan began to take its final shape. Sarah proposed that the group coordinate a carefully timed series of actions during the inspection. Rather than filing a single complaint that could be easily buried, they would create multiple touch points that would make the pattern of abuse impossible to ignore. The plan involved several coordinated elements. First, Staff Sergeant Torres would request a private meeting with General Morrison through official channels, using her seniority and clean service record to ensure the request would be granted. During this meeting, she would present the documented evidence of Colonel Blackwood's behavior and request immediate investigation. Simultaneously, Sergeant Major Chen would approach the senior enlisted advisor accompanying General Morrison. As a peer in the non-commissioned officer ranks, he would have natural access to this individual and could share information about the broader cultural problems at Fort Henderson. Captain Hayes would ensure that certain key documents were accidentally included in inspection materials that would be reviewed by General Morrison's staff. These documents would include incident reports, personnel complaints, and other evidence that had been previously buried or ignored. Most importantly, Sarah and the other women would be strategically positioned during various inspection activities, where their presence and professionalism would be obvious to the visiting officials. If Colonel Blackwood attempted any inappropriate behavior during the inspection, it would occur in front of witnesses who couldn't be intimidated or silenced. Major Sullivan volunteered to be present during the inspection as a legal observer, ostensibly conducting routine legal business at the base. Her presence would ensure that any developments could be immediately documented and protected from later manipulation. The final element of the plan was perhaps the most audacious. Sarah had discovered that Colonel Blackwood was scheduled to give a presentation to the inspection team about base communications capabilities. This presentation would take place in the same communications center where the hair-pulling incident had occurred, and it would involve several of the women who had witnessed that incident. Sarah proposed that if Colonel Blackwood displayed any inappropriate behavior during this presentation, the witnesses would immediately document it and report it to General Morrison's team. The goal was not to provoke an incident, but to ensure that if the colonel's pattern of behavior continued, it would be observed by people with the authority to take immediate action. As the meeting concluded, each participant understood their role and the risks involved. They knew that if their plan failed, they could face severe retaliation from Colonel Blackwood and his supporters. They also knew that success would require flawless execution and a degree of courage that went far beyond normal military duty. Sarah felt a mixture of anxiety and determination as she drove back to her apartment that evening. She had committed herself and her allies to a course of action that would either result in justice or career-ending consequences. There was no middle ground and no opportunity for retreat. Over the next 2 days, the participants in the plan made their final preparations. They rehearsed their roles, double-checked their documentation, and prepared for every possible scenario they could anticipate. They also reached out to additional allies who could provide support if things went wrong. The most crucial preparation involved ensuring that their evidence was properly secured and backed up. Major Sullivan arranged for copies of all documentation to be held by the military advocacy organization, ensuring that the evidence couldn't be destroyed or lost even if the participants faced retaliation. As Monday morning approached, Sarah found herself unable to sleep. She spent the night reviewing every detail of their plan, thinking through possible complications and preparing responses to likely challenges. She knew that the next few days would determine not only her own future but the futures of every woman at Fort Henderson who had suffered under Colonel Blackwood's abuse of power. Annual inspection would begin at 800 hours on Monday morning. By the time it concluded on Wednesday afternoon, either Colonel Blackwood would be facing consequences for his actions, or Sarah and her allies would be facing the full weight of military retaliation for challenging a powerful officer. There would be no ambiguity about the outcome, and there would be no opportunity for a second chance. The battle lines were drawn, the evidence was prepared, and the allies were in position. All that remained was the execution of a plan that would either vindicate the courage of these women or destroy their military careers in spectacular fashion. Monday morning arrived with an unusual tension that seemed to permeate every corner of Fort Henderson. The base had been preparing for this annual inspection for months, but there was an undercurrent of anxiety that went beyond the normal stress of military evaluation. Sarah arrived at the communications center at 0530 hours, 90 minutes before her normal start time, to ensure that everything was perfectly positioned for the day's events. General Patricia Morrison arrived at Fort Henderson at exactly 0800 hours, accompanied by a team of 12 inspectors and advisors. Her reputation preceded her like a storm front, and even the most seasoned officers on the base showed visible nervousness as her convoy pulled through the main gate. General Morrison was known for her penetrating questions, her attention to detail, and her absolute intolerance for any form of misconduct or unprofessional behavior. Colonel Blackwood had spent the previous week preparing for this inspection with obsessive attention to detail. His uniform was immaculate, his presentations were rehearsed to perfection, and he had coached his subordinates extensively on proper protocol and responses. He saw this inspection as an opportunity to solidify his pending promotion and transfer to the Pentagon, and he was determined to make an outstanding impression. What Colonel Blackwood didn't know was that his usual control over information and narratives was about to be systematically dismantled by people he had dismissed as powerless. The first phase of Sarah's plan unfolded exactly as scheduled. At 0930 hours, Staff Sergeant Torres requested and was granted a private meeting with General Morrison. This meeting took place in the base commander's conference room, with only General Morrison, her senior aide, and Torres present. Torres began her presentation by establishing her credentials and service record, then methodically laid out the evidence she and the others had gathered about Colonel Blackwood's pattern of sexual harassment and abuse of authority. She presented documentation, witness statements, and a timeline that showed how complaints had been systematically buried or ignored by the base leadership. General Morrison listened without interruption, taking detailed notes and asking pointed questions about specific incidents and witnesses. Her expression grew increasingly grim as Torres continued her presentation, and she immediately recognized the legal and institutional implications of what she was hearing. Staff Sergeant Torres, General Morrison said when the presentation concluded, "You understand that these are extremely serious allegations against a senior officer?" "Yes, ma'am." "I also understand that failing to address these allegations would be a betrayal of every woman serving under my command and yours," Torres replied with quiet determination. While Torres was meeting with General Morrison, Sergeant Major Chen was implementing the second phase of the plan. He approached Command Sergeant Major Williams, the senior enlisted advisor accompanying the inspection team, during a routine tour of base facilities. The conversation between the two senior non-commissioned officers took place in the motor pool, where they could speak privately while observing routine maintenance operations. Sergeant Major Chen outlined the cultural problems at Fort Henderson, focusing on the pattern of protected misconduct and the fear that female soldiers felt about reporting inappropriate behavior. Command Sergeant Major Williams had seen similar problems at other bases and immediately understood the implications of what Chen was describing. He assured Chen that the inspection team would investigate these concerns thoroughly and that appropriate action would be taken to protect the soldiers who had come forward. Meanwhile, Captain Hayes was executing the most technically complex part of the plan. During the routine document review process, she had strategically placed several pieces of evidence where they would be discovered by General Morrison's administrative team. These documents included personnel files showing patterns of complaints against Colonel Blackwood, incident reports that had been filed but never acted upon, and correspondence that revealed attempts to suppress investigations. The documents were discovered at approximately 1100 hours by Major Lisa Rodriguez, General Morrison's chief administrative officer. Major Rodriguez immediately recognized the significance of what she was reading and brought the documents directly to General Morrison's attention. By noon on Monday, General Morrison had received information about Colonel Blackwood's misconduct through 3 separate channels. This convergence of evidence from multiple sources made it impossible to dismiss the allegations as isolated complaints or personal vendettas. General Morrison called an emergency meeting with her senior staff to discuss the developing situation. She also requested that Major Sullivan, who was conveniently present at the base, be included in the meeting as a legal advisor. This gave Sarah's team direct access to the decision-making process and ensured that their evidence would be properly evaluated and acted upon. The meeting lasted for 2 hours, during which General Morrison's team reviewed all available evidence and developed a strategy for addressing the allegations. They concluded that immediate action was necessary to protect potential victims and preserve the integrity of the ongoing investigation. At 14:30 hours, General Morrison made a decision that would change everything. She ordered that Colonel Blackwood be immediately relieved of his command duties and placed under investigation for sexual harassment and abuse of authority. She also ordered a comprehensive review of all personnel complaints and incident reports from the previous 3 years to identify any additional victims or patterns of misconduct. The news of Colonel Blackwood's suspension spread through the base like wildfire. Soldiers who had witnessed his behavior or heard rumors about his conduct reacted with a mixture of shock, relief, and satisfaction. Many couldn't believe that someone had finally held him accountable for his actions. Sarah learned about the suspension while she was working in the communications center. Captain Hayes entered the room and quietly informed her that the first phase of their plan had been successful. Sarah felt a surge of emotion that she struggled to control while maintaining her professional composure in front of her colleagues. However, the most dramatic moment was still to come. Despite being relieved of his command duties, Colonel Blackwood was still scheduled to give his presentation to the inspection team about base communications capabilities. General Morrison decided to allow this presentation to proceed, but under very different circumstances than anyone had anticipated. At 1600 hours, Colonel Blackwood entered the communications center to deliver his presentation, unaware that his career and reputation were already in ruins. He had not yet been formally notified of his suspension, as General Morrison wanted to observe his behavior during the presentation before taking final action. The presentation began normally, with Colonel Blackwood displaying his usual authoritative demeanor as he explained the base's communication systems and capabilities. Sarah and several other female soldiers were present as part of the demonstration, operating equipment and answering technical questions. General Morrison and her team observed the presentation from the back of the room, paying careful attention to Colonel Blackwood's interactions with the female personnel. What they witnessed exceeded their worst expectations and confirmed every allegation that had been made against him. During the presentation, Colonel Blackwood made inappropriate comments about several female soldiers' appearances, stood unnecessarily close to Sarah while she demonstrated radio equipment, and made suggestive remarks that caused visible discomfort among the women present. The final straw came when Colonel Blackwood repeated his hair-pulling behavior, this time targeting Private Chen during a demonstration of satellite communication equipment. He grabbed her hair and jerked her head back while making a crude comment about maintaining proper standards. The room fell into complete silence, but this time the silence was broken by General Morrison's voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Colonel Blackwood, step away from that soldier immediately," General Morrison commanded, her voice filled with authority and barely controlled anger. Colonel Blackwood turned around in surprise, suddenly realizing that his behavior had been observed by the most powerful person on the base. The color drained from his face as he understood that his career had just ended in the most spectacular and humiliating way possible. General Morrison ordered military police to escort Colonel Blackwood from the communications center immediately. As he was led away, every person in the room understood that they had witnessed a moment of justice that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The first day of the inspection had exceeded Sarah's most optimistic expectations. Colonel Blackwood had been not only suspended, but had actually demonstrated his misconduct in front of the senior military officials, who had the authority to end his career permanently. The battle was far from over, but the most crucial victory had been achieved. The events following Colonel Blackwood's dramatic removal from the communications center unfolded with the speed and intensity of a controlled explosion. Within 2 hours of his escort by military police, the entire base was buzzing with news that one of the most powerful officers at Fort Henderson had been suspended and was facing serious charges related to sexual misconduct. General Morrison immediately convened an emergency command meeting that included the base commander, senior staff officers, and representatives from the Inspector General's office. The meeting took place in the base's secure conference room, where the magnitude of the situation could be discussed without interruption or external interference. The base commander, Colonel Patricia Stevens, found herself in an extremely difficult position. She had been Colonel Blackwood's peer and had worked closely with him for over 2 years. While she had heard occasional rumors about his behavior, she had never witnessed it directly and had not taken action to investigate the concerns that had been raised. General Morrison was not sympathetic to Colonel Stevens's predicament. "Colonel Stevens," she said with ice in her voice, "how is it possible that a pattern of sexual harassment this extensive could continue for years under your command without any meaningful intervention?" Colonel Stevens attempted to explain that she had never received formal complaints about Colonel Blackwood's behavior, but General Morrison cut her off with documentation that Captain Hayes had prepared. The evidence showed that multiple informal complaints had been made, and that several formal complaints had been filed, but had mysteriously disappeared from personnel files. The Inspector General's representative, Lieutenant Colonel Maria Vasquez, outlined the scope of the investigation that would be required to fully address the situation. This investigation would need to examine not only Colonel Blackwood's individual actions, but also the systemic failures that had allowed his behavior to continue unchecked. Meanwhile, Sarah and the other women who had come forward were providing detailed statements to military investigators. These interviews were conducted by specially trained personnel who understood the complexities of sexual harassment cases and the courage required for victims to speak publicly about their experiences. Major Sullivan served as legal counsel for the women throughout this process, ensuring that their rights were protected and that they understood the potential consequences of their testimony. She also worked to coordinate their statements to ensure consistency and to identify any additional evidence that might strengthen the case against Colonel Blackwood, the investigation revealed details about Colonel Blackwood's behavior that were even more disturbing than the initial allegations had suggested. Investigators discovered that he had been using his position to coerce female soldiers into uncomfortable situations, that he had retaliated against women who had resisted his advances, and that he had created a culture of fear that extended far beyond his direct victims. One of the most significant discoveries was a pattern of personnel transfers and reassignments that suggested Colonel Blackwood had been systematically removing women who might pose a threat to his continued misconduct. Several female soldiers had been transferred to less desirable positions after refusing his advances or expressing discomfort with his behavior. The investigation also revealed the extent to which other officers had been complicit in protecting Colonel Blackwood. Several senior staff members had received complaints about his behavior, but had failed to take action. Some had actively discouraged women from filing formal reports, warning them about potential career consequences. As news of the investigation spread beyond Fort Henderson, it attracted attention from military leadership at the highest levels. The Secretary of Defense's office requested regular updates on the progress of the investigation, and congressional representatives began asking questions about the military's handling of sexual harassment cases. The media attention was intense and immediate. Within 48 hours of Colonel Blackwood's suspension, reporters were gathered outside the base gate seeking information about the developing scandal. The Army's Public Affairs Office struggled to manage the story while the investigation was ongoing. Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm that she had never anticipated. While military regulations protected her from being identified publicly, the broader story of her courage in confronting a powerful abuser resonated with people across the country who had experienced similar situations. In their own workplaces, the impact on Fort Henderson was profound and immediate. The base's entire leadership structure was effectively frozen, while investigators examined the extent of the cultural problems that had enabled Colonel Blackwood's behavior. Several other officers were placed under investigation for their roles in covering up or ignoring complaints. For Sarah, the days following Colonel Blackwood's suspension were emotionally overwhelming. She experienced a complex mixture of relief, vindication, exhaustion, and anxiety about what the future might hold. The courage she had shown in confronting Colonel Blackwood had made her a hero to many, but it had also made her a target for those who resented the disruption she had caused. Support for Sarah and the other women came from unexpected sources. Female veterans organizations rallied to their cause, providing legal support and public advocacy. Military families across the country expressed support for their courage in speaking out against abuse of authority. Even male soldiers at Fort Henderson began to acknowledge that the women had done something necessary and important. The formal charges against Colonel Blackwood were filed on Thursday of that week. He was charged with multiple counts of sexual harassment, assault, abuse of authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The charges were serious enough to result in court-martial proceedings and potential criminal penalties. Colonel Blackwood's response to the charges was predictable and pathetic. Through his military lawyer, he denied all allegations and claimed that his interactions with female soldiers had been misunderstood or mischaracterized. He suggested that the charges were part of a conspiracy to damage his reputation and prevent his promotion to the Pentagon. However, the evidence against Colonel Blackwood was overwhelming. The investigators had documented dozens of incidents involving multiple witnesses. They had recordings of inappropriate comments, photographs of inappropriate behavior, and testimony from soldiers across multiple ranks and time periods. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following month, but it was already clear that Colonel Blackwood's military career was finished. Even if he somehow avoided criminal conviction, the evidence of his misconduct was too extensive and too public for him to continue serving in any capacity. The impact of the case extended far beyond Fort Henderson and even beyond the military. Sarah's story became a symbol of the importance of speaking out against workplace harassment and abuse of power. Organizations across the country began reviewing their own policies and procedures for handling harassment complaints. For Sarah personally, the experience had been transformative. She had discovered a strength and courage within herself that she had never known existed. She had learned that individual action, when supported by allies and guided by careful planning, could challenge even the most entrenched systems of abuse and corruption. As the initial crisis phase of the investigation began to wind down, Sarah started to think about what she wanted to do with the rest of her military career. She had proven herself to be a leader and an advocate for justice, and she realized that she wanted to use her experience to help other women who might find themselves in similar situations. The reckoning that had begun with Colonel Blackwood's hair-pulling incident was far from over. The investigation would continue for months. The legal proceedings would take even longer, and the cultural changes at Fort Henderson would require sustained effort from multiple levels of leadership. But the most important victory had already been achieved. A powerful predator had been exposed and held accountable for his actions. A group of women had found their voices and used them to protect others from abuse. And a military base had been forced to confront the toxic culture that had enabled misconduct to flourish in darkness. The woman who had walked into the communications center on that March morning had been transformed by her experience. Sarah Martinez was no longer just a communications specialist following orders. She had become a leader, an advocate, and a symbol of the power that comes from refusing to accept injustice in silence. 6 months after Colonel Blackwood's dramatic downfall, Fort Henderson had become a completely different place. The transformation was so thorough that new personnel arriving at the base could hardly believe the stories they heard about the toxic culture that had existed just months earlier. Sarah Martinez found herself at the center of this transformation, though not in the way she had originally expected. Following the successful prosecution of Colonel Blackwood, who had received a dishonorable discharge and served 6 months in military prison for his crimes, Sarah had been offered several opportunities that would have taken her away from Fort Henderson. The Pentagon had offered her a position in their newly created Office of Sexual Harassment Prevention and Response. Military advocacy organizations had invited her to leave active duty and join their staffs as a full-time advocate for service members' rights. Several universities had offered her full scholarships to pursue advanced degrees in law or public policy. However, Sarah had made a decision that surprised many people, including herself. She chose to remain at Fort Henderson and accept a promotion to staff sergeant, with a new role as the base's sexual harassment prevention coordinator. She wanted to help rebuild the culture that had been so badly damaged, and she felt that her experience and credibility made her uniquely qualified to lead that effort. The position was newly created specifically for Sarah, and it came with unprecedented authority for someone of her rank. She reported directly to the base commander and had the power to investigate complaints, recommend disciplinary action, and implement policy changes designed to prevent future misconduct. Sarah's first major initiative was the creation of a comprehensive training program that went far beyond the routine sexual harassment prevention classes that had previously been conducted at Fort Henderson. Her program included realistic scenarios, interactive discussions, and frank conversations about the dynamics of power and abuse that had enabled Colonel Blackwood's behavior. The training sessions were initially met with skepticism and resistance from some male soldiers who viewed them as punishment for Colonel Blackwood's individual crimes. However, Sarah's approach was neither preachy nor accusatory. Instead, she focused on building understanding about how everyone could contribute to creating a professional environment where all soldiers could succeed. One of the most powerful elements of Sarah's training program was her willingness to share her own story in detail. She described not only the harassment she had experienced, but also the fear, confusion, and isolation she had felt before deciding to take action. Her honesty and vulnerability helped other soldiers understand the real impact of seemingly minor acts of misconduct. The program was so successful that it began attracting attention from other military bases. Within a year, Sarah was traveling regularly to conduct training sessions and consult with commanders who were dealing with similar cultural problems. Her expertise was sought after by senior military leaders who recognized that the old approaches to preventing sexual harassment had been largely ineffective. Meanwhile, the other women who had supported Sarah's efforts were also thriving in their careers. Staff Sergeant Torres had been promoted to Sergeant First Class and was serving as a mentor to junior enlisted personnel. Private Chen had completed her training as a communications specialist and was being considered for officer candidate school. Captain Hayes had been selected for promotion to major and was being transferred to a prestigious assignment at the Army War College, the success of these women sent a powerful message throughout the military community. Rather than facing career retaliation for their courage in speaking out, they had been recognized and rewarded for their leadership and integrity. This outcome encouraged other service members to report misconduct and trust that the system would protect and support them. The cultural changes at Fort Henderson extended far beyond formal policies and procedures. The relationships between male and female soldiers had evolved to become more professional and respectful. The atmosphere of fear and intimidation that had previously characterized interactions between different ranks had been replaced by a culture of mutual respect and support. These changes were reflected in measurable outcomes as well. Reports of sexual harassment and assault at Fort Henderson had decreased dramatically, while reports of misconduct were being handled more quickly and effectively than ever before. Morale surveys showed significant improvements in how female soldiers viewed their work environment and career prospects. Sarah's work also attracted attention from civilian organizations dealing with workplace harassment and abuse. She was invited to speak at conferences, participate in research studies, and contribute to policy discussions about how military approaches to preventing misconduct could be adapted for civilian workplaces. One of the most meaningful recognition Sarah received came from an unexpected source. General Morrison, who had played such a crucial role in exposing Colonel Blackwood's misconduct, wrote a personal letter commending Sarah for her courage and leadership. The letter was included in Sarah's personnel file and would follow her throughout her military career as a testament to her character and integrity. The letter read, in part, Staff Sergeant Martinez demonstrated extraordinary courage in challenging systematic abuse of authority at significant personal risk. Her actions not only protected current and future victims, but also upheld the highest standards of military service and personal integrity. She represents the very best of military leadership and serves as an inspiration to all who serve. As Sarah approached the 3rd anniversary of the incident that had changed her life, she reflected on how much had changed, not only at Fort Henderson but in her own understanding of leadership and responsibility. She had learned that individual action, when guided by principle and supported by allies, could create change that extended far beyond what anyone might have imagined. The young communications specialist who had been humiliated and assaulted by Colonel Blackwood had been transformed into a recognized leader in military culture change. But more importantly, she had discovered that her experience, however painful, had given her the knowledge and credibility to help others avoid similar situations. Sarah's story had become part of military training curricula, leadership development programs, and academic studies of organizational culture change. However, she remained focused on the practical, day-to-day work of helping individual soldiers navigate challenging situations and build careers in an environment of mutual respect and professionalism. Looking toward the future, Sarah planned to continue her military career with the goal of eventually reaching senior leadership positions, where she could influence policy and culture at the highest levels. She was considering pursuing advanced education in organizational psychology or public administration to enhance her ability to create systemic change. The transformation that had begun with one woman's refusal to accept abuse in silence had rippled outward to affect thousands of service members across the military. Sarah Martinez had proven that individual courage, when combined with careful planning and strategic allies, could challenge even the most entrenched systems of power and corruption. Her next move had indeed left the whole base speechless, but not in the way Colonel Blackwood had intended. Instead of being silenced by his abuse of authority, Sarah had found her voice and used it to create lasting change that would protect countless others from experiencing the humiliation and fear she had endured. The little girl from California who had joined the military to serve her country had become a leader whose impact would be felt for generations. Her legacy was not just the downfall of one abusive officer, but the creation of a culture where such abuse could never again flourish in darkness and silence. Colonel Blackwood had made the mistake of targeting someone who possessed not only courage but also the intelligence and determination to turn his moment of abuse into a catalyst for transformation. His attempt to humiliate and intimidate had instead awakened a force that would ultimately make the military a better place for everyone who chose to serve.